Thank you for listening to the History of the Papacy podcast. I'm Steve and I'm your host. If you enjoy the History of the Papacy podcast, you may like the History Unplugged podcast and Key Battles in American History podcast from two great friends of the show and collaborators, Scott Rank and Professor James Early. Learn more about these two great podcasts at the website historyonthenet.com. Let me quickly mention Patreon. Patreon is a great way to support the show. Your support at Patreon does a huge effort to helping this whole operation keep going. Joining Patreon has plenty of benefits, including, but not limited to, being included on the History of the Papacy diptychs, which is a list of, in traditional Christianity that's the list of bishops who are commemorated, and they're commemorated in order. So if you want to be on the list earlier, you have to sign up early to get on that list. So I definitely highly encourage you to go over to patreon.com/History of the Papacy podcast or search for History of the Papacy podcast and Patreon to find out more. And now with History of the Papacy Patreon diptychs, at the Alexandria level, we have Roberto, Joran, William, Brian, Jeffrey, Christina, and John. At the Constantinople level, we have Dapo, Paul, Justin, and Lana, all of whom are magnificent. And then reaching that ultimate power and prestige, we have Peter the Great at Rome. Today, I'm going to present to you the very next episode that Garry Stevens and I have put together on the 12 minor prophets of the Old Testament. And of course, as I said, it's featuring Garry Stevens of the History in the Bible podcast. I think you will learn so much about how early Christianity developed through reading and understanding the 12 minor prophets, because there's so much connection in there. Now, in today's episode, Garry and I will delve into Haggai and Zechariah. And both of these prophets wrote about the construction of a new temple. And we know these books happened in time very closely together within a couple of months, which I think that is really cool because we have really exact dating, but you'll find out more about that now. So I just want to thank everyone for listening. I hope you like the teaser episodes I've been posting and the outtakes. Some of the best conversations Garry and I have are these outtakes, so I think you'll enjoy those. And I definitely would love to hear your feedback on Apple Podcasts or iTunes. 5-star ratings are great, but any rating will help me, and review will help me understand more what you're thinking. And with that, here is another piece of the mosaic of the Popes of Rome and Christian Church. Welcome back to another exciting episode of our series on the 12 minor prophets. But believe me, you, and believe Garry, you, that there is nothing minor about these prophets. They're ready, and we are ready for two more. We're doing two prophets a time, and today we have a shorter prophet, a little longer prophet. We're featuring Haggai and Zechariah. Garry, how are you doing on this wonderful day?
I am fine on this drippy day.
Now, let's take a look. We're going to talk a little bit about these two books. Haggai, a little shorter, like I said. Zechariah, a little more. I guess you might say he's going in a little bit more of the strange direction, like some of our friends like Daniel and our apocalyptic writers. Let's just dig right in and start off with Haggai. Maybe give us a little bit of the background on Haggai.
Okay, Haggai, which in Hebrew is pronounced Haggai, so not much change there, thank goodness. His name means born on the festival. Now, Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi are the three prophets after the exile. So the Israelites are back home under Persian rule, and Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi are the ones who are speaking to the people at that time. As far as we can gather, Haggai and Zechariah are virtually contemporaries. Now, the book of Haggai, which is very short, dates itself precisely to the day, which is very unusual. It says that Haggai started prophesying in the year 520 BCE, in the 6th month of the 2nd year of the reign of Darius I. Now, that was about 18 years after Cyrus the Great, the Persian ruler, commanded the temple to be rebuilt. The book gives several other little timestamps, and it's clear that Haggai only prophesied for 4 months. So some of our prophets were prophesying for decades, but Haggai says just 4 months, and it's very unusual to have this sort of precise dating. Some prophets, as we'll see next time we say Joel, we really have no idea when they lived. Before, after the exile, before this, before that. But Haggai, he's great. He dates himself precisely. Now, at this time, the Persian Empire is at its peak, and the Israelites are living fairly happily under the Persians. The Israelites love the Persians, because the Persians were pretty happy-go-lucky when it came to religion. In fact, they encouraged all their subject peoples to stick to your customs, mate, everything is fine. Everyone, from what I can call it, from ancient times, thought that the Persians were really quite nice people. If you want to be ruled by anyone, the Persians would be your man. As I said, this happens during the time of Darius or Darius I. He's the guy who led the first failed Persian invasion of Greece, where he was defeated by the Greeks at the Battle of Marathon.
Yeah, that was the thing I was thinking about when I was reading the book and thinking about Cyrus. Cyrus and the Persians were very happy-go-lucky as long as you went along. If you went along to get along. If you were the Greeks and you didn't do that, then they weren't quite so happy-go-lucky.
That's true. I mean, I'm sure they allowed the Greeks to practice their own religion, but what they weren't keen on was revolution and revolt. As long as you kept the peace, you could believe what you liked and do what you liked. If you broke the peace, well, then we will send this ginormous army to kill you all. Now, Haggai consists of 4 fairly straightforward narrative reports, and Haggai is talking to a guy called Zerubbabel. I'm not entirely sure how to pronounce that. Zerubbabel?
Zerubbabel? I mean, that's anyone's guess. There's like 5 syllables in there. You can put the accent on any one of them you want, stress whatever one you want.
I should have checked this, but I didn't. I'm not entirely sure that Zerubbabel, whatever, is a Hebrew name, because that Babel bit at the end sounds a bit suspicious, doesn't it?
Yeah, there's something. It seems too long, too something to it.
I mean, it could be Hebrew, because it ends with El, which is the name of God. So that's possible. Zerubbabel is the governor of Judea. He's a fairly mysterious figure. And then now the Israelites are trying to rebuild the temple. Now, after 20 years in exile, they're having a bit of difficulty getting their act together. There's famines, the farms aren't working too well. Maybe they got a bit too comfortable in Babylon and a bit too urban, and they've forgotten how to plant wheat. And Haggai declares that, well, we're having trouble here in the Promised Land because we haven't built the temple. Priests must have loved that idea. It's pretty self-serving if you're a priest, isn't it? Oh no, forget about the farms won't produce properly until we have our temple. Anyway, Haggai convinces Zerubbabel that, okay, our number 1 priority should be rebuilding the temple. And eventually the temple is rebuilt as Haggai promised. The focus of Haggai's theology is the temple as the incarnation of God's word and the embodiment of the covenant. Haggai is pretty embedded in the politics of his day. As I said, he mentions Zerubbabel, and he also mentions a high priest, Joshua. And he says that this government, you have a secular ruler, Zerubbabel, and you've got the high priest, Joshua. They are the legitimate successors to the Davidic monarchy. So this is the first time that we see a power split. Until now, and say, for example, well, in the entire period of the 2 kingdoms, 1 king. He's the boss. He runs everything. The Davidic monarchy is a sacred monarchy, and in the Old Testament, when you hear high priests mentioned, they are strictly subordinate to the king. But now, the high priest is elevated to the same status as the secular governor. Interesting, as we'll find, Zerubbabel and Joshua also feature in Zechariah and in the books of Chronicles and Ezra, Nehemiah.
Is there any historical record of Zerubbabel?
No, the Bible is it.
So we don't know if he was a Persian. And so that would be interesting. Was he a Persian governor? Was he a honcho amongst the Judeans?
I mean, I think he's fairly well established to have existed in the first place because he is mentioned in so many different books. Now, the Book of Chronicles, the books of Chronicles, which have got to be the least read books in the Old Testament, the chronicler states that Zerubbabel is in fact a grandson of the second last king of Judah. And the last we heard of this king, who was Jehoiakim, he was taken off to Babylon by the Babylonians, obviously, and comfortably retired there. We do have some documents from Mesopotamia which mention Jehoiakim and how the Babylonians gave his household wheat and oil and wine and that sort of thing. So they seem to have treated him fairly well. So Zerubbabel may have been a grandson of that king. But on the other hand, why is Zerubbabel just a governor then? Why aren't the Judeans saying, "Oh, can we have a little kingdom, O mighty Persia? And here is our king"? This may have a bearing on what happens to Zerubbabel.
And just to put it into context, because this is, I don't know why I didn't put this connection together, but it was only, how many years was it that that kingdom of Judea fell, and now essentially the time of Haggai? And now a word from our sponsors.
I mean, the impression you get the impression in the public mind is that it lasted for centuries.
Yeah.
But it only lasted about 55 years.
Yeah, 2 generations. I mean, you could have somebody who was in their 20s who was somewhat in the game, in power at least, and they could be in their 80s so it could happen in one person's lifetime.
It was certainly in when they returned, the actual exile itself was in living memory. You know, the original deportation of the people.
And how many people are we talking about were deported?
Oh, there's a lot of controversy about that. Scholars are undecided between what's called the empty land theory and what you might call the chock-a-block theory. Under the empty land theory, which is supported by the chronicler, the whole place was pretty much depopulated. Everyone was taken back, except for some recalcitrants, or people who were just simply too insignificant and poor for the Babylonians to worry about. Other scholars say no. Very few people were deported. The chronicler does give some numbers and figures, which are something like in their tens or hundreds of thousands, but it's unclear how reliable these are. So the answer is we don't know. But we do know that the Bible was at pains to stress that pretty much everyone was deported, and when they came back, they did find some people, but these people were no longer regarded as true Israelites. The theology came to be that in order to be a true descendant of Abraham, a son of Abraham, follower of God, you had to have gone through the exile. You were basically an apostate if you stayed back home.
So that must have really caused a conflict point between the people who stayed. And presumably it was, I mean, at least it seems like the books tell it this way, that it was the higher class that was taken in exile, which kind of makes sense, that those would be the people who you wouldn't want around anymore and leave the country bumpkins because who cares? You know, they're not the learned class, and then you can actually use them, too, to do stuff. You're not going to make a high priest plow or dig a ditch or something.
Well, if I recall, the book of Nehemiah specifically mentions conflicts when he was rebuilding the walls of Jerusalem. And he has various neighbouring peoples, and I think he calls them the peoples of the land, rather objecting to the rebuilding of the walls and being rather resentful that all these Israelites have come back. So the Bible certainly records conflict.
You have people who are related to them, but not quite them, who maybe speak a slightly different language, slightly different culture, but it's a good way to separate yourself from them, and it's a great reason. And then now you're coming back, the Israelites from Babylon. Oh, we're the real Israelites, and you can't be Israelites anymore. It works very well.
I suppose the relationship would be the same between the Israelites and the Samaritans. And in fact, I suppose there's a good case to be made that the Samaritans are, in fact, the descendants of the people who stayed behind.
Yeah, that seems very logical.
And, I mean, in classical times, the Israelites and the Samaritans did not get along well at all. And even today, there's a lot of friction between the two communities. My favourite French sociologist, Pierre Bourdieu, said that you find the greatest conflict between groups which are almost but not quite identical, because they struggle to define boundaries between themselves. Pick your favourite European ethnic conflict, tension sort of thing. Haggai's place in Judaism and Christianity. Well, he doesn't really have one. Haggai is never used in any reading in the Jewish liturgy, simply not there. Christian lectionaries, which are books which recount readings for the various masses and that sort of thing, he's mentioned one or two times. So neither Judaism nor Christianity find Haggai interesting at all. And that's probably because, as I said, Haggai's only around for 4 months, and he's preoccupied with a long-dead minor political figure, Zerubbabel, whom I doubt most Christians or Jews have ever heard of. I'll give you an example of Haggai from chapter 1. God is talking to Haggai. In the 2nd year of King Darius, etc., 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 through the prophet Haggai to Zerubbabel and to Joshua, son of the high priest. Thus says Yahweh of hosts. These people, the Israelites, say, the time has not yet come for rebuilding the house of Yahweh. Is it a time, says God, for you to dwell in your panelled, mansions, while this house, the temple, is lying in ruins? Fat bloody chance. Get building the temple. Go up to the hills and get timber and rebuild the house. Then I will look on it with favour and I will be glorified. Now Haggai now goes on in the 1st chapter. Zerubbabel and the high priest Joshua and all the rest of the people gave heed to the summons of God and to the words of the prophet Haggai. And Haggai, Yahweh's messenger, fulfilling Yahweh's mission, spoke to the people. I am with you, says Yahweh. Haggai is fairly full of himself, you must admit. He refers to himself in the 3rd person and says, thanks to me, God will now look upon us favourably. And that's pretty much what the whole book is about.
And thank you, Haggai. We really appreciate it.
Haggai chapter 2 is another exhortation where Haggai says, be strong, Zerubbabel, be strong. Build my temple, man. Work faster. In chapter 2, Haggai has a failed prophecy. Haggai says, chapter 2, 20, and the word of Yahweh came to Haggai. Speak to Zerubbabel. I am going to shake the heavens and the earth, and I will overturn the thrones of kingdoms and destroy the might of kingdoms and nations. I will overturn chariots and their drivers. Horses and their riders shall fall, each by the sword of his fellow. On that day, declares Yahweh of hosts, I will take you, O my servant Zerubbabel, and make you as a signet, for I have chosen you. Haggai is predicting that Zerubbabel will become the king of the Israelites. That didn't work. That didn't turn out. And as we'll find in Zechariah, they had to fudge that. Because although Zerubbabel and Joshua start to build the temple, it looks like they're not around when it was finished, but we'll get to that later. Now, you mentioned, Steve, about how it seems like a presentation before a local town board.
Yeah, it really is. It is not, it does not strike you as a religious book. It's kind of, like you said, Haggai, oh wow, I'm a great guy. Zerubbabel is a great guy. Let's get the temple built, talk to God a little bit, the end.
Now that, amazingly, is the entire book of Haggai. It's simply an exhortation to the leaders of the Israelites to get the temple built. With that in progress, Haggai signs off and says, okay, I'm done.
And he moves on to who knows what great things he went on to that were not recorded by time. And now a word from our sponsors. Now our next prophet is prophet 2 for today is Zechariah. And I'm sure his name is pronounced many better ways. Let's set the background, because Zechariah, if you're reading or listening to any of the books of the minor prophets, you can tell instantly the tone has changed with Zechariah. Maybe let's talk a little bit about Zechariah and his background, and then see where we go with that, because it's even though he's talking about many of the same things that Haggai talks about, it is in a quite different style.
Oh, very different. I mean, Haggai it's a straightforward narrative and account. There's very little theological about it. It's just saying what's happening in the politics of his day. A lot of Zechariah is completely off the wall, as we'll see. The two prophets, Haggai and Zechariah, are clearly tied to each other. In Zechariah's opening verses, he actually says that he lives at the same time as Haggai. His name, Zechariah, which in Hebrew is Zechariah, so big difference, means Yahweh has remembered. I mean, did they actually think, oh, hi, Yahweh has remembered? Or did they go, hi, Zechariah?
I think that's always interesting, like with Native American names, where they have like a long name that means something. Because like I suppose even in English names, I guess for most of our names are quite removed from any like intrinsic meaning to them. Stephen has an intrinsic meaning to it, and Garry, I'm sure, does. I can't think of the etymology offhand for it, but I'm sure it's not just a random set of sounds, presumably.
I've heard that Garry is related to Garth and Gareth and means something like either spear carrier or husbandman, but you don't make the connection. I mean, obviously you don't make the connection.
And it's certainly not when you were born, your mother was like, he's a spearman or a husbandsman, you know. So it's clearly that it's not. And I wonder if that was the case back then. There was other Zechariahs, I believe, in the Bible.
Zechariahs or Zacharias?
Either were there. I mean, there was definitely other Zacharias. Were there other Zechariahs?
I don't know.
And it's interesting in later times how the names kind of contracted, especially amongst women's names. I think Mary was 30% of the names in Judea, and Martha was another significant number of the names. And even Jesus was a very common name, and John was a very common name. So they had gone from all these names, Zechariah, Jonah, this, that, Zerubbabel, and then they focused it down to about 6. I want to say, I think it was James Tabor. He was the one who discovered, or I'm doing air quotes if you're listening, the James ossuary, James, brother of Jesus, son of Joseph. It wasn't proven to be real, but those 3 names accounted for some insane percentage of the people in Palestine at that time.
That's weird, isn't it? I mean, are we just exceptional, say, in the West now in having huge numbers of first names? Because I remember thinking about the Romans. Apparently they only had about 10 first names as well. Mm-hmm. And all their women's names were versions of the male names. So Julius, Julia.
You know, it's an interesting one. I've never read anything. I haven't dug very deep into it, but in ancient Palestine, Jesus' mother's name would be Maria, essentially. And one of those women's names in Rome was Maria. Marius was the male version, and then Maria was the women's name. And they're completely unrelated. And I wonder if that's maybe why Mary stuck around so well.
Oh, I see, because it's both a Latin and a Hebrew name.
Hebrew name, yeah. If it had such staying power, I don't know. It is interesting, though, that they're completely unrelated. But Maria would have been a fairly common Latin Roman name. I don't know how so much in the Greek, probably not.
Well, your name's Greek, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. I guess so, yeah.
Oh, well, there's a Stephen in the New Testament.
Yeah, and he was Greek.
I think Stephen means something like crown.
I think in the Middle Ages, they had a lot less names to pick from.
And until recently, there were some countries which, in law, you could only pick from a certain list, couldn't you?
In Switzerland, that's still the case.
I think in Denmark too.
Or maybe it is Denmark. It's Switzerland or Denmark because they just legalized a really common name.
Okay.
It could be Muhammad, but don't quote me on that. I don't think it was Muhammad. It was something else. Maybe it was. I don't know. That sounds like a better story, but it's a fairly common name that just was legalized because they just recognized that religion. Yeah, I don't see what the big deal is. Maybe in the past where documentation wasn't so great, and so you could just make up whatever, if you wanted to make up whatever name to like start a new identity. But now you're pretty well cataloged from day one. I think that's the same thing with the Puritans too. They have names like Mercy this, and at least with women's names. But there was a big uptick in really like old school Old Testament names too. Obadiah and Nisadiah and
Do the Amish still have that habit?
I think they do.
I wonder if they've got any Zerubbabels wandering around.
Yeah, that's a missed opportunity there.
Okay, back to Haggai and Zechariah. Zechariah is the polar opposite to Haggai. Haggai is a pragmatic man relaying God's words to the Jewish leadership. Zechariah, as we'll see, is basically off his nut. Now, some scholars think that the book of Zechariah was in fact written by two separate authors. The first Zechariah, in the first half of the book, is exactly who he says he is. He's the contemporary of Haggai. But the second half of the book, it is believed, was written maybe around the year 450 when Greece is threatening the Persian peace. Zechariah does have themes similar to Haggai. It emphasises the rebuilding of the temple, and it also legitimates the dual leadership, secular and religious, under which the temple will be built. The book emphasises repentance and exhorts the community to obey God's will. And like Haggai, Zechariah says, okay, the building on the temple is stalled, we got to do something about it. Whereas Haggai literally just says that, Zechariah has a series of 8 trippy visions. Now, let's start with Zechariah chapter 1, verse 8. In the night I had a vision. I saw a man mounted on a bay horse, standing among the myrtles in the deep, and behind him were bay, sorrel, and white horses. I asked, what are those, my lord? And the angel who talked with me answered, I will let you know what they are. Then the man who was standing among the myrtles spoke up and said, these were sent out by Yahweh to roam the earth. Now, for a start, this is really odd in any Old Testament context you care to name. Maybe Ezekiel and Daniel are out there. Zechariah is having some sort of visions. But interestingly, as you pointed out, Steve, these visions aren't communicated by God. God is not talking to Zechariah. An angel is talking to him. chapter 2, another vision in chapter 2. Zechariah says, I looked up and I saw 4 horns. I asked the angel, what are those? Those, replied the angel, are the horns that tossed Judah, Israel, and Jerusalem. Then Yahweh showed me 4 smiths. That's hard to say. What are they coming to do? I asked. He replied, these men have come to throw the horns into a panic, to hew down the horns of the nations, and then raise a horn against the land of Judah, to toss it. It sounds a lot like Revelation, doesn't it?
Yeah, it sure does. Going back to that first verse you read about the horses, and I believe Haggai had something about the horses too. There was a lot of detail about horses, sorrel and dapple, and I don't even know what those are exactly with horses, but they seem that we should know what they mean by those.
Now, if I remember correctly, Revelation mentions bay sorrel and white horses.
Yeah.
So Revelation is directly quoting Zechariah. Now, these visions of Zechariah would be the oldest little apocalypse that we have. Okay, we'll get to the apocalypse bit in a minute. In fact, Zechariah is often called a proto-apocalypse. It's early. It's older than Daniel, because Daniel seems to have been written in pretty much Greek times. And Zechariah is the first prophet to come up with stuff which is sounding really pretty trippy.
Yeah, it's not all in, though, on the apocalyptic language. It's still a little normal stuff in there, too.
It's not the extended hallucinations of Revelation. Zechariah goes on about the angel. The angel showed me Joshua, the high priest, standing before the angel of Yahweh, and Hasatan standing at his right to accuse him. The angel of Yahweh said to Hasatan, Yahweh rebuke you, O Hasatan. May Yahweh, who has chosen Jerusalem, rebuke you. For this is a brand plucked from the fire. Now Joshua was clothed in filthy garments. Then the angel spoke up and said, man, dress this guy up, clean him up. Then the angel gave the order, let a pure diadem be placed on his head. Now, a diadem implies some sort of kingly powers. So, like Haggai, Zechariah is a big booster of Joshua. Now, Zechariah has just said, Joshua is my man, in effect. And Zechariah continues, and the angel of Yahweh charged Joshua as follows, if you walk in my paths and keep my charge, you in turn will rule my house and guard my courts. Hearken well, O high priest Joshua, I am going to bring my servant the branch. Now, he's not saying, I am going to bring my servant a branch, like a twig. He's saying the name of the servant is the branch.
Yeah, I guess there's a couple of things. This is one of the best little sections of Zechariah. The first thing is that Hasatan gets a mention in there. The scene is them yelling at Hasatan, but Hasatan really hasn't done anything. So we're kind of left thinking that he must have done something before this scene that we don't know about. You know, he's kind of getting admonished, but he hasn't, they didn't explain what he did, how he accused Joshua.
Hasatan just seems to be like hanging around.
Yeah, and then he gets accused. Yeah. Joshua's alive at this point, correct?
Yeah, he's fine.
So Joshua's been brought to this someplace where there's angels and Hasatan, and he's being dressed in rags. That paints a very odd image in your mind. You know, what's Joshua think about this? Is he like cognizant of what's going on here?
I suppose the whole thing must be symbolic. I mean, Joshua is the high priest. He's not just some guy, wandering around. So I think when it says, now Joshua was clothed in filthy garments, and the angel puts a diadem on his head, that's symbolic.
It's all purely symbolism.
So Zechariah is saying, now the angel of God is sanctifying you, even though you're already running the place. But now it's official.
And then the other interesting part of this is when I was reading, I'll preface this, the first thing that I read is that the Branch Davidians, the Christian cult, for the lack of a better word, from the 1990s. They have a really interesting history. The Branch Davidians, the ones who were in Waco, that the government, they had conflict. That particular group that was led by Vernon Howell, who took on the name David Koresh, which is interesting in and of itself. They were Seventh-day Adventists, and apparently they had broken off from the Seventh-day Adventists, and one of the leaders went and founded a little colony. It's not in Waco, Texas. It's just about halfway in between Austin and Dallas, and it's right off the highway. But if you're ever traveling down that way, they have a museum set up there. One of the neighbors bought the property and set up a museum there. That person, I cannot remember his name at the moment, but he broke off from the Seventh-day Adventists, splitting off of the Seventh-day Adventists. In the 80s, this Vernon Howell, he had come from somewhere else, and he kind of fell in. He was kind of a failed seminarian in Seventh-day Adventists, but a lot of people liked him. Him and 4 other people, it was 7 people, they had an actual firefight in the 80s and took over the compound. It just so happened that the person who owned the compound was in all sorts of legal trouble because he dug up a dead body and wanted to test David Koresh to say, if you're really who you say you are, you can raise this dead person. So David Koresh went and called the police on him and said, this guy dug up a dead body. One thing led to another, and that's how David Koresh took over this compound, was that they had a literal, actual gun battle. And the police never got involved, nothing. I don't think there was ever any arrests for it or anything.
So his movement was born in violence, and it died in violence.
And so then he takes his name, David, from the house of David, and then Koresh was the Persian version of Cyrus. There was some sort of play on the theology of that, of why he picked that name. This was also referenced back to, and I don't know if this, I didn't dig any deeper, but that in Isaiah, there was talk of branches in the Davidic line. I mean, at least in this verse that we're talking about in Zechariah, it's very closely associated.
Now, Zechariah is talking, like Haggai, about 2 leaders, secular and religious. Haggai specifically mentions Zerubbabel. Zechariah sometimes mentions Zerubbabel, but often doesn't. He talks about not Joshua and Zerubbabel, but Joshua and the branch. So he substitutes the word the branch, Zerubbabel. Now, why does he do that? That's because something mysterious happened to Zerubbabel. We know that from the book of Ezra chapter 6. And this passage is talking about the dedication of the temple. And Ezra says, "So the elders of the Jews progressed in the building, urged on by the prophesying of Haggai and Zechariah. And they brought the building to completion under the aegis of the God of Israel. The Israelites, the priests, and the Levites, and all the other exiles celebrated the dedication of the house of God with joy. And they sacrificed for the dedication of this house of God 100 bulls, etc., etc., etc." What is significant about that passage is that Joshua and Zerubbabel are not mentioned. They have disappeared. We don't entirely know what happened to Joshua. The theory about Zerubbabel, and remember, both prophets say that Zerubbabel will be an anointed king or, top dude or something. He never made it. So the idea is that perhaps Haggai and Zechariah are talking about, we're going to have a king. And the Persians go, "No, I don't think so." And maybe they simply got rid of Zerubbabel, or he was told to keep his mouth shut. So both Zerubbabel and Joshua disappear in spite of all the big hoopla which Haggai and Zechariah make, talking about how these guys are going to run the joint forever.
Yeah, it's interesting because I believe that the Persians in some cases had allowed local kings, but I think maybe the Israelites are thinking that they're maybe a little big for their britches, as they say.
That could be. Maybe the Persians are thinking, yeah, okay, well, if we give them a king, maybe they'll decide they want, independence.
Yeah, a bridge too far.
Governor, fine. King, no.
And then the Philistines will want a king, and the Erethites will want a king, and it might not even be on their radar.
So the Persians would be wary of once one mob starts asking for something, then maybe the whole place will fall apart. Now, anyway, ladies and gentlemen, Zechariah continues with a whole bunch of kooky visions.
One of the very interesting ones is from verse 5 of Zechariah, and it's the vision of the flying scroll. So let your mind go crazy with this one. Then I turned and raised my eyes and saw there a flying scroll. And he said to me, "What do you see?" So I answered, "A flying scroll. Its length is 20 cubits, and its width is 10 cubits. And then he said to me, "This is the curse that goes out over the face of the whole earth. Every thief shall be expelled according to this side of the scroll, and every perjurer shall be expelled according to this side of it."
Now that is one big flying scroll. I mean, a cubit, if I remember, is sort of the length of your forearm, and it's what, 20 long and 10 wide?
Yeah, 20 by 10. That is a heck of a scroll. Yeah, and what's its motive power? Did somebody throw it? Is it flying with wings?
Any idea what that vision's meant to convey? I got no idea.
My other question is, now scrolls were generally, as far as I know, only written on one side. They weren't written on both sides. You couldn't flip the scrolls around. You couldn't spin them either. You couldn't wind or unwind them effectively if they weren't written in duplex as in the technical term. Or was the scroll, would that make sense if it was, now that would be if it was 10 high and it's about the length of your forearm, that would be very high. But 20 of that long, 20 cubits long seems like that might be about the right size. Yeah. And a scroll page being about 6-ish to 12 inches wide, one sheet could be about that. And I think 20 sheets in a scroll isn't out of this world. Saying that it's 6 feet tall, that's a lot of scroll.
I mean, it sounds roughly like the size of a billboard.
Yeah. It's very odd imagery. So they're certainly making a point with that.
Speaking of odd imagery, here's another one of his visions. Then the angel said, "Oh, you ain't seen nothing yet. Now look up and note this other object that is approaching." I asked, "What is it?" And he said, "This tub that is approaching. This," said he, "is their eye in all the land." And behold, a disk of lead was lifted, revealing a woman seated inside the tub. "That," said the angel, "is wickedness." And thrusting her down into the tub, he pressed the leaden weight into its mouth. Now, I presume the leaden weight is some sort of cover for the tub. But okay, so we have a woman wickedness in a tub.
In a flying tub.
And it seems rather nasty to keep this poor woman trapped in a tub, doesn't it? But this particular vision continues. "I looked up again and saw 2 women come soaring with the wind in their wings and carry off the tub between earth and sky." "Where are they taking the tub?" I asked. And he answered, "To build a shrine for it in the land of Babylonia." Huh? Well, I don't know what the tub is meant to represent. And then, the passage says they're going to build a shrine for the tub containing this wicked woman.
It's always so hard to parse out, too, what is symbolic and what is metaphorical and then what is literal. Is it a literal tub? Is it some other type of tub that we don't know? Is it an unusually large scroll? Is it a metaphorical scroll?
I mean, for all we know, these images could be referring to common cultural constructs at the time, but utterly elude us. But Zechariah turned out to be fairly popular with Christian thinkers, and he's quoted a few times in the New Testament. Zechariah chapter 9. Rejoice greatly, fair Zion. Raise a shout, fair Jerusalem. Lo, your king is coming to you. He is victorious, triumphant, yet humble, riding on an ass, on a donkey foaled by a she-ass. Now that is quoted in the Gospel of John, where we see Jesus arriving in Jerusalem on Palm Sunday. This passage in Zechariah was taken as a key proof text, as they call them.
Yeah, it seems like there's quite a bit of that in Zechariah that the Christians said was they were referring to Jesus. You can see that there was quite a bit in a lot of these of the 12 minor prophets that the Christians really sunk their teeth into. More or less, then, Zechariah goes along this. It's a lot of apocalyptic imagery, and if you're listening to this, or if you go and read Zechariah, I think you'll see the connections to Daniel and the book of Revelation in the New Testament are very common, and I think you'll definitely see that they are very reminiscent of those books.
Next time, we'll be covering Joel and Malachi. Malachi is the final of the post-exilic prophets, and Joel, we don't know. We have no idea when Joel lived. Its book gives us no context whatsoever, so we're just throwing him in at the end.
Yeah, we'll take a little Joel at the end, and that'll be that. And we'll have a couple other episodes after that to wrap all this up. You can't do 6 episodes on the minor prophets we got to rate them and rank them and wrap them up. Look for the next time, Joel and Malachi, and we will talk to you soon.